I could have survived betrayal in private, but what he did was worse because he needed an audience for my humiliation. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy, or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it. While I was inside it, everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. There is something uniquely cruel about being discarded publicly by someone who once claimed to love you. Affairs are painful enough on their own, but when a man begins using comparison, mockery, or public distance to elevate the other woman while lowering you, the emotional damage changes shape. It stops feeling like heartbreak alone and starts feeling like erasure. That was the season I entered without fully understanding what it would cost me. The hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. He had been drifting for months, but the real shift came when he stopped hiding his disrespect. He praised her in front of me. He rolled his eyes when I expressed hurt. He turned my attempts at honest conversation into proof that I was insecure, dramatic, and impossible to satisfy. The affair was not only happening behind my back, it was gradually being used to reposition me as the unreasonable woman in the room, while he played wounded innocence. I kept minimizing it, because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience, rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present. It reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. The breaking point came at a gathering where he laughed at one of her jokes, put his hand on the small of her back, and looked at me with a kind of irritation that said I was the one ruining the mood simply by existing. Later that night, I found messages confirming what my body had already understood. They were not only involved, they had bonded over criticizing me. Reading that after being publicly diminished felt like standing outside my own life watching two strangers discuss my pain like entertainment. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt, yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped, my breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. Once the truth surfaced, the pattern was impossible to ignore. He had been using my confusion to flatter her. He had been using our private struggles as material in their emotional connection. He was not just leaving one relationship for another. He was constructing a narrative in which he could look justified, she could look special, and I could be reduced to the flawed woman who made his betrayal easier to defend. That kind of humiliation lingers because it attacks your dignity, not just your trust. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. For a while, I thought her winning him meant she had won something valuable. Then reality started to correct that story. Men who need to humiliate one woman in order to feel exciting with another do not suddenly become healthy partners in a new relationship. They carry the same vanity, the same immaturity, and the same appetite for admiration into whatever comes next. The pattern eventually follows them, because the pattern lives in them. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable softening language, and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not. When I finally confronted him, I did it without begging. That mattered. He expected tears, accusations, and chaos he could later use against me. Instead, I asked specific questions, named specific moments, and refused to participate in the performance of him being misunderstood. He tried to make it about compatibility, timing, emotional distance, anything except the basic truth that he had chosen cowardice and cruelty, because they served his ego better than honesty would have. In that conversation, I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. The relationship with her did not last the way he imagined it would. Once I was gone, there was no injured partner left to make him feel powerful by comparison. Without that contrast, the two of them had to face each other directly, and apparently that was much less romantic than the fantasy. I heard later that the same communication problems, disrespect, and blame shifting appeared almost immediately. I was not surprised. If anything, I was relieved to see reality finally interrupt his arrogance. That stage taught me more about character than the actual discovery did, because it showed me who I was becoming under pressure, and who the other person remained when the lies were no longer working. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes. The paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, my decision was less dramatic than people imagine and more important than any single argument. By the time he reached back out, I no longer needed anything from him. Not an apology, not validation, not closure. I had already done the harder work of rebuilding myself without using his regret as a shortcut. That was the real victory. Not that he lost her too, but that I had stopped organizing my value around his choices. Once that happened, his collapse was simply information, not healing. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it, step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace. It began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways. By keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. He humiliated me for her because he thought power came from making me smaller. In the end, all he proved was that a person willing to degrade someone publicly for temporary validation will eventually stand alone with the consequences of that character. I survived the humiliation. He became it. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what truth